All right, folks, we are about ready to go live. When you get into the room, pretty simple. You just put your questions over there in the chat window. I do have some questions that have been emailed in, so we'll start with those. And as you bring the questions to chat, we'll go over to that. All right, so we're going to schedule to go live in about 3 minutes, and we'll do it then. Thanks. All right, it is now 1 o'clock, so we can get started. I'm going to start with, as I said, some questions we've got that were emailed in. So first, got a student asking, this is about in the methods class, they're asking about the Obama's religion variable. So with student says, I copied it and was trying to recode the negatively coded values because they're technically missing values. When they copied this new variable at the bottom of the page, the variable is completely missing. I also tried to do recoding different variables, change the negative values into 0. Then I tried system missing, but none of these worked. Then I tried to add a missing value in the missing variable column, doing discrete range from -7 to -4 and -1, but that didn't work either. All right, so first off, when you're working with that variable, yeah, you need to get rid of the missing values first. So you're going to do just with the missing values column in the variables screen. So you're just going to go in and set those missing values. You can actually just set like -7 to -1 or -10 to -1, just so all the missing values all the negative values wind up being missing. All right. Now, in this question, what you're trying to get at is the percentage of people who think he's a Muslim, Obama's a Muslim, or the percentage of people who think he's a Christian. So if you're trying to find out the percentage of people who think he's a Muslim, there is a category for that in the existing variable. You don't need to make a new variable for that necessarily. So what you can do is you just run a frequency command on that variable, what is Obama's religion variable, run a frequency command on it. That'll give you the percentage of people who think that Barack Obama is a Muslim. Then you've got at that point, you can build a margin of error around that, right? So I've got a percentage of people who think Barack Obama is a Muslim. I've got an N, right? Because sample size for the entire question. And I've got the P that I need to calculate my standard error. P in this case is the proportion who think something or say something. So P in that case is the proportion of people who think he's a Muslim. So if it's 28%, in the equation is P times 1 minus P, 0.28 times 1 minus 0.28, and divide by square root. You know the equation. You can look it up. Regardless, that'll give you all the information you need in order to actually figure out what percentage of people think he's a Muslim and give you the plus or minus on that for the margin of error. Again, we're assuming 95% confidence interval because your standard error times your we call it the Z star is going to tell you your margin of error. All right. So the other thing on the Obama religion variable you're going to have to take a look at is for Christian. Yeah, if we're asking if Obama is Christian, that could be Protestant or Catholic. So you have to create a new variable that's going to put Protestant and Christian in the same, Protestant Catholic in the same one. And to do that, you're going to do the recode into new variable and just build the logic tree like we did in class to create one category for Protestant and Catholic. Now, you can, if you want to, not do that. So if you want to, you can actually just stick with the original variable. and just add up the percentage, the number who think he's Protestant and the number who think he's Catholic, and do it manually. But you're going to need later on to have that variable anyway, so you might as well create it now using the recoding different variables and put both of those categories for Protestant and Catholic into one category, call it Christian, and then put everyone else into a different variable. I would call that, make a dummy variable 0 if they don't think he's Protestant or Catholic, 1 if they do think he's Protestant or Catholic. And of course, watch for your missing values. Then you create a second variable for Muslim. Is Obama a Muslim? Same thing, create as a dummy variable, 1 if they think he's a Muslim, 0 if they don't think he's a Muslim. And once you have those dummy variables, putting together your margin variables is pretty simple. Okay, 2 questions related to that. Is the n the value not including values coded as missing? All right, so this is kind of a conceptual question about what it means to have a missing value, right? So if someone answers, I don't know, you could make the argument that they are in fact saying, no, I don't think he's a Muslim, or no, I don't think he's a Christian. And if that's the case, you actually would include it in the n as kind of a negative response. Generally, though, when someone says, I don't know, it could mean they don't know when they don't, or it could mean they just don't want to say. So I tend to just take those missing values out completely. And if you properly set up the variable, so the missing values are actually listed as missing, it's not a problem. They're automatically excluded when you do the calculation. All right, and so it's following up. And then for the mean and the margin of error calculation, the confidence interval, is that the same? No. The mean would not be the same. So for Christians, the mean, the p, for the margin of error calculation, would be the percentage of people who think he's a Christian, and for Muslim, would be the percentage of people who think he's a Muslim. Right, so the mean variable, that mean value, is just the percentage of people, or proportion of people who think he's a Muslim. So if 20% of respondents think Barack Obama is Muslim, the mean value for the Muslim dummy variable would be 0.28. If 62% think he's a Christian, the mean value for the Christian dummy variable would be 0.62. Okay. All right. I had a couple questions from the American Government and Politics class. So let me go over a couple of those while we're waiting for some more questions to come in. Question number 41. What circumstances make it more likely the Supreme Court will issue a writ of certiorari? Okay. So remember, a writ of certiorari was actually an order to send up the documents. So writ just means documents. So a writ of certiorari is when the Supreme Court says, we want to hear this case. So it's instructing the lower court, send us all the documents relating to that case. So the Supreme Court doesn't issue very many writs of certiorari. It used to be before the 1920s, they had a mandatory docket. The Supreme Court had to listen to every single case that was appealed to it. It no longer does. Since the 20s, it doesn't have to. So it takes a vanishingly small percentage of all the cases that it could take. So it makes it more likely they're going to take a case. 2 big factors here. The first big factor is if one more thing. In order to take a case, the Supreme Court has to have 4 votes. So 4 of the 9 justices have to vote to take the case in order for it to come up. So not a majority, not 5 out of 9, but 4 out of 9 have to take the case. Vote take the case and issue the writ of certiorari. 2 big factors that make it more likely the Supreme Court's going to issue a writ of certiorari. The first one is if there's disagreement at the circuit court level. So if the First Circuit and the 12th Circuit have disagreed on a point of constitutional interpretation, that's a problem, because the circuit courts are the last word before the Supreme Court and what the Constitution actually means. So if the First Circuit and the 12th Circuit have come to different conclusions about the meaning of a law or the constitutionality of a law, that effectively means the Constitution means 2 different things in 2 different parts of the country. And that is untenable. That you can't have the Constitution mean different things in different parts of the country. And so the Supreme Court is going to have to step in to resolve that problem. So if you've got circuit court disagreement, the Supreme Court's going to be much more likely to issue a writ of certiorari. Second, if the Solicitor General gets involved, the Solicitor General asks them to, the Supreme Court's more likely to do it. Solicitor General works for the president. He is essentially the lawyer for the executive branch, not the president's lawyer, not a personal lawyer for the president, but the lawyer for the executive branch of government. And if the Solicitor General asks the Supreme Court to hear a case, the Supreme Court is much more likely to hear that case. Solicitor General doesn't actually get a lot of love. You don't hear about him very much. So much you hear about like the Attorney General. But Solicitor General is a very important figure, and it's much more like the Supreme Court will take a case if Solicitor General asks them to do it. Okay, number 48. What led to the rise of the Whig Party? So the Whig Party was a party, if you remember, that rose in the 1830s as part of the opposition to Andrew Jackson. The Whigs being the group in Britain that traditionally had been opposed to the king. The Whig political party in America saw Andrew Jackson as being akin to a king, and so they rose up against him. The big problem they had was slavery. They weren't abolitionists because they knew being abolitionist would really piss off the Southerners. They didn't want to do that. So as a result, what they did was they just didn't talk about slavery. So there was this whole series of compromises, Missouri Compromise, Compromise 1840, all these different compromises trying to resolve the slavery issue, and none of them really worked. And the Whigs simply didn't have a strong stance on slavery. They generally wanted to stop the expansion of slavery, but they didn't want to piss off the Southerners enough they'd secede. So what they wind up doing, not talking about not doing anything. And that was perfectly tenable up until the late 1850s, when you had a big popular movement against slavery. Think of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Think of the Great Revival that happened in the northeastern part of the United States. This religious revival that really came out as anti-slavery. And at that point, the Whig Party split because they had a large group of people who were now vehemently anti-slavery, and they weren't doing anything about it. All right, let's go back to comments over here. Cecilia says, another question I had related to standard calculation of Obama religion. Do we treat it as dichotomous? Yes. So if you've got the two dummy variables, then you can treat it as dichotomous. So it's certainly not a continuous variable, because you can't say Obama is 1 Muslim, 2 Protestant, 3 Catholic, 4 Mormon. Like, it doesn't make sense. So you determine dummy variables, then treat those dummy variables as stochastic, dichotomous. So standard variable is p times 1 minus p divided by the square root of n. Exactly right. So again, if the 62% of people think Obama is a Christian, it would be 0.62 times 1 minus 0.62 divided by the square root of the sample size. And you'd use the whole sample size. Generally, that would exclude the missing variable, the missing values from that calculation. All right. We also had a question about dummy variables and which dummy variables we actually make. So on the test, on the methods later on, you have to do some race dummy variables. And the question is, how many do you have to do? And the answer is, it is completely up to you. I do want at least 2, but that's a lower limit, not an upper limit. You could make 6 if you wanted to. You can make 7. The one real substantive question you have to ask about that is whether you want to treat Hispanic as being separate category, ethnicity, than race. So you, in theory, could have Hispanic not, there's plenty of people who are white but Hispanic or black but Hispanic. And so you can treat Hispanic as a separate dimension, as a separate set of variables, rather than treating Hispanic as being, white, black, or Hispanic, which is, factually incorrect, although we do it in survey research all the time. So when you're creating those dummy variables, you can create as many as you want. I do want to get at least 2. The most important thing you have to do with that is when you put together those dummy variables, make sure that you are paying very close attention to what the comparison value is. Remember, dummy variable coefficients are always going to be relative to whatever the excluded category is. So if I'm treating Hispanic as being part of my racial categories, and I've got white, black, Asian American, and Hispanic, and I exclude white, then the variable on African American or black is relative to the values for whites, right? So it's always going to be relative to whatever value gets excluded. If my only dummy variables are for African American and Hispanic, then the coefficients of them are going to be relative to everyone who is neither African American nor Hispanic, right? So they have that giant other category. So when you're creating dummy variables, keep that in mind what you're comparing it to, and in general, make the ones that make sense, like that you have strong expectations about. We don't often include dummy variable for Asian American because in most variables, those dependent variables, we don't have a strong expectation about how Asian Americans are different than other groups. So as a result, there's no reason. If I don't have a reason to believe that this group is different, then there's absolutely no reason to actually include that group. Cecilia, first off, don't worry about asking questions. That's exactly why I'm here. Cecilia's asking, for dummy variables in question 3, religion again, missing values become 0. They're including the crosstab. Is that okay? I wouldn't make the missing value 0. I don't like doing that. I would rather the missing values be excluded, set them to system missing. So that's one of the options. You can say all the negative values. On the left side of the screen, what the old values are, you can just put all the negative values over there. And on the right side, set that to system missing. If you have correctly set up the missing values in your original variable, that kind of should happen automatically. So I would get rid of those missing values. If they are in there, I don't think it's that big a problem. And as I said before, you can make a case for including them. I generally exclude them. But if you want to include them, and just make a note of that in your paper, and that's probably okay. It's not going to throw the results off very much. Okay, back to a question we had from the American Government Politics exam. Number 10, it says explain Congress's reaction to the Chadha decision. Chadha v. INS, this is an early 1980s decision about single house legislative vetoes, or SHLVs. Remember, for the test, you're going to have to know all these acronyms, so you have to know what an SHLV is. So Chadha in Chadha v. INS, so first off, what is an SHLV? So single house legislative veto is when Congress sets up an agency and sets up rules such that the agency it gives given discretion. It can do things that Congress wouldn't normally allow it to do, but there's going to be a check on that power. And the check on that power is that Congress, either one house of Congress or even one committee within Congress, can go ahead and put a stop to that extra thing the agency is doing with its discretion. So the example we have in the INS is the old agency. It's now called the USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. The old version was the INS, or the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So in Chadha, what had happened was the INS had been given discretion to allow certain foreigners and give them visas, even if they didn't meet the statutory requirements for those visas. And Chadha was one of these guys who had been admitted to the United States on a visa waiver issued by the INS. Now, this visa waiver was subject to a single house legislative veto, where the House of Representatives, the one committee on the House of Representatives, was allowed to vote to overturn that decision by the INS commissioner. And in this case, they did. Chadha then sued. So Chadha was supposed to get a visa to come to the United States, and he didn't, because Congress voted that he, in particular, should not get it, which is, I guess, a little bit flattering question mark, that all of Congress got together and said, you don't get a visa. Regardless, Chadha sued, got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, INS v. Chadha, said you can't do that. Why? Because when you pass a single legislative veto in that way, an SHLV, it essentially has the force of law. That is, Congress is doing something that has the force of law. And if Congress does something that has the force of law, they have to follow what's called the presentment clause. The presentment clause in the Constitution says you have to pass the bill to both houses of Congress and present it to the president, hence presentment. And in SHLVs, you haven't done it. So these SHLVs are unconstitutional. Now, Congress did not like this. Congress doesn't want to deal with a lot of degree stuff. Congress is generally okay with giving agencies more discretion. But in this case, Supreme Court saying you can't. So Congress likes the SHLVs, or they're unconstitutional, and the agencies like the SHLVs, because if the SHLVs didn't exist, Congress would be less willing to give that agency that extra discretion. So what happened in the wake of Chadha v. INS, both the agencies and the congressional committees in Congress decided to pretend the SHLV still worked, and we're still there. And so they did. So Congress essentially kept on using single house legislative vetoes. The agencies kept on accepting them, and everyone went along with it and kind of ignored the Supreme Court ruling. So we still occasionally get agencies putting forward, now we would probably call informal SHLVs, but they do still happen because it's in everyone's best interest. Remember, what does the agency want? Agency generally wants discretion. A lot of people think agencies want budget. They don't. They don't want money. They want more freedom to do what they want with their money. And think about it this way. If you get an extra $1,000 a month in income, but your rent goes up by $1,000, you're not happier, right? All the money you got in goes out. Agencies the same way. If Congress gives them extra responsibility, stuff they have to do, and gives them money to cover that, the agency's no better off. They don't have any extra discretion. They don't have any extra spending money. So agencies like it when Congress gives them money. It doesn't necessarily tell them what to do. They want some degree of discretion. So what's going on here? This gets right at discretion. The agencies want discretion. SHLVs encourage Congress to give them discretion. Congress wants to give discretion. They just want to have more powerful oversight. So everyone decided to ignore the INS v. Chadha decision. All right. Let me see. I think I've got a couple more questions that came in on the came over there. Okay, so yes, we still have a couple more questions coming in for the American government politics. Again, if you've got questions, whatever class you're in, put it over the chat window, and I'll be happy to deal with them as I go through these email questions that have been emailed in already. Okay, so it says, suppose New Jersey wanted to increase voter turnout in local midterm elections. What reforms could we adopt to do so? This is question number 39 on the study guide. All right, so this is a little bit of a trick question because one of the big ones you have is AVR, there's automatic voter registration. A lot of states have adopted AVR. And that does tend to increase turnout. Why? Well, the big reason people don't turn out to vote is because they're not registered. How can you fix that? Just register everyone to vote, which is exactly what New Jersey did by adopting AVR. So it used to be in New Jersey and most states because of the HAVA, or the Help America Vote Act. If you went to the DMV, you had to be given the opportunity to register to vote at that point. So that's because of HAVA, or the Help America Vote Act. However, under an AVR system like we now have in New Jersey, when you go to the DMV or go to any government agency where you give your name and address and all that, they not only have to give you the option to register to vote, in fact, they automatically register you to vote unless you opt out of it. So it's no longer about, oh, should I register to vote? It's unless you say, no, I do not want to register to vote, you will be registered to vote. So we already have AVR, so that's something that's expected to increase voter turnout in the future. So because more people register to vote, so voter registration is not an issue. What else can we do? Have more early voting. So early voting means that people can go to certain polling places before the election. So if you don't have off on the Tuesday election day, you can go the Saturday before or the Monday before. So you can go days before. That increases voter turnout. You can also have vote by mail systems, or VBM. I know there's a lot of acronyms here: HAVA, AVR, VBM. But vote by mail also increases voter turnout, generally by a pretty significant margin. The idea is that instead of actually going to the polls, you actually just get your ballot in the mail a month before and you send it back. This can lead to some problems. There's opportunities for fraud here, as we saw in North Carolina recently, but it does tend to increase voter turnout. This is used very widely in California and in Oregon right now, largely because it does increase voter turnout so much. Last thing you can do in New Jersey is you could put together the dates in which you actually run elections. There's, you could have elections, all your elections running on the same day. So generally what people like to do is they like to vote in elections for big things, but not necessarily elections for small things. So what you do is you run your election for your big and your small things all on exactly the same day, right? And that would increase voter turnout as well. Okay, so I've got a question for, in this case, back in the methods, back in the research methods. So number 6, even if people believe Barack Obama is Muslim, maybe it doesn't matter. After all, maybe those individuals didn't like Obama to begin with, so the false belief might not impact their views. Do individuals who think Obama is Muslim rate Obama differently on a feeling thermometer scale than those who know he's a Christian? Use a graph to pick the feeling thermometers for the two groups. All right, so what this question is asking. So number 1, what I want you to do is take a look at the feeling thermometers for everyone who thinks that Barack Obama is a Muslim versus the feeling thermometer for everyone who thinks that he is a Christian. What you're going to find, of course, is that people who think Obama is a Muslim rank him lower on the feeling thermometer than people who think he's a Christian. So you need a graph to do that. Now, there's a couple ways to do it. The easiest is to do a select variable. So when you're doing the graph, you can select and select only certain values. So you could go ahead and put the 0. You go ahead and say with your dummy variables for Christian, Muslim, and only select one value. Select the value of 1 on Christian, 1 on Muslim, and that would do it there. You can also do it under data filter. So if you go to in the data menu and you go to filter, you can put in a command there. So the command there could be filter if Muslim. So I'm assuming you got a dummy variable for Obama Muslim, where 0 he's not a Muslim, 1 he is a Muslim. So filter so that if Muslim equals 0, then that is filtered out. Then run the feeling thermometer. Then unfilter, back the same thing. When you go into it, you go back into where the filtering is. Unfilter the data and do the same thing with your Christian dummy variable. Christian equals 1. Run the feeling thermometer again. Make a graph of it, and you can see how those are different. All right, can we confident the difference between groups is real and not just all a sampling error? So that's essentially asking you would take the mean value for the feeling thermometer for each group. And this is continuous. So you'd have to build me a continuous margin of error around that. So you build a continuous margin of error. Again, you guys know how to do that at this point. You can look it up. So you build a continuous margin of error. So you have to have the mean and the standard deviation. Now you can get that once you do that filtering we just talked about. If you wanted to, you could go back to the filtering and just run a descriptors table for the feeling thermometer, and that'll give you the mean and the standard error. Then use that to construct a confidence interval or a margin of error around that. And it says it's going to be 99.5% certain there's really a difference in the values in the underlying population. So you create a 99.5% confidence interval. to find the z-star for 0.995 confidence interval, you would look at your z-score table and find the value that corresponds to 0.25%. Because that would, yes, 0.25%, 1/4%, because that would give you 1/4% high, 1/4% low. When you put it together, you would have 1/2 of 1% total, 99.5% in the middle. All right. Okay, let's go back to some more that we had from the methods, and then I'll switch back over into the American government one. Okay, so now it's asking, so this is number 8. Perhaps people are saying Obama isn't a Christian as a way of asserting their political identity. Again, make sure you use the 7-point party ID scale. I haven't heard some people who are trying to make their own party ID scale. You can do that. You can use those 3 questions that we have. We talked about the party ID questions in the past. You can use those to create your own party ID scale, but it is unnecessary. You don't need to. They've already put together a 3-point and a 7-point party ID scale. So just use the 7-point one. All right, so perhaps people saying Obama isn't a Christian is a way of asserting the political identity. Is there a statistically significant correlation to saying Obama is a Muslim in party identification? So for this, the first thing you need to do is make sure when you look at your party ID variable, you've gotten rid of the variables. I'm sorry, the missing values. If you have missing values in there, it will throw everything off. So you do not have any missing values in there. Once you do, and you've got down, I think it's 0 to 6 or 1 to 7. Once you get in there, just run the correlations, right? You run a correlation between party ID and thinking Obama's a Muslim. And that I would do it with your dummy variable because when you're doing a correlation, it cannot be with a nominal level variable. However, the dummy variable is not nominal level. The dummy variable is actually, because dichotomous, is actually interval level. I'm sorry, it's ordinal level. That is, people who think he's Muslim think he's more Muslim than people who think that don't think that. So that's theoretically ordinal level. So I can run a correlation on that. So I run a correlation between 2 variables, and we'll see if there's statistically significant correlation. Spoiler alert, there is in fact statistically significant correlation. Okay, again, if you're just in the room, go over and put your questions over in the chat window, and I'll get the questions there. If you would rather email them over to me, that is fine as well. We'll be checking the email rather regularly through the course of this. We've got another 35 minutes to go over any of those questions. All right, let's keep on going. Let's do one more from methods, and then we'll go back over into American government. Okay, number 9. It's not entirely clear what the independent effect perception of Obama's religion has and how he's evaluated in the feeling thermometer measure. Why not? Because we know that party ID matters a lot for this. That is, there's lots of Republicans who think Obama's a Muslim, and most Democrats don't. So if it's correlated that tightly between party ID and how people feel, and people's beliefs about his religion, it's not at all clear that there's actually going to be an effect there. Right? It could be that it doesn't matter at all what they think his religion is. We're just seeing a effect of party ID. So the idea we have for number 9 is to run a regression. So we use as our regression model, we would use party ID. Again, use that 7-point party ID scale. Make sure the missing values are taken out, and throw in the Obama's a Muslim dummy variable in there. So the idea is that does the Obama Muslim thing actually have an effect, given if we already control for party ID? Then we take that into number 10. Number 10 says, based on the results, what would be the expected feeling thermometer ranking for Obama for a strong Republican who believes Obama's Muslim versus one who doesn't believe he's Muslim? How for individual leans toward the Democratic Party? So these are just values. So we've got, in this case, number 9, you ran a regression model with 2 predictors. Predictor number 1 is Obama's a Muslim, and predictor number 2, what is your party ID? So I'm just asking you to put values in there. So a strong Republican on that value, I think, is a 0, or maybe it's a 1 on the party ID variable. So put that value in there. Whatever 1, again, check your variable coding, and then put in a value for the perception of Obama's religion, which if it's if we're using dummy variable for 0 or 1, for is Obama Muslim or is Obama non-Muslim. Super easy. So you guys got 2 variables, put those variables in there, given the coefficients you got from your regression. And once you do that, you can create an expected value. Only thing people ever screw up on here is making sure is not including the constant. You have to include the constant. If not, your answers will, of course, be wrong. All right. Okay. Let's see. Moving on. Next set of questions. Okay, number 51. Who won the bank wars? The bank war. This is another question about Andrew Jackson. Number 51. So the bank war is fought between Andrew Jackson, who wanted to get rid of the National Bank of the United States, and the head of the National Bank, a guy named Nicholas Biddle. So who won the bank war? Well, Jackson did. Jackson won the bank war because the bank did eventually shut down. Jackson eventually was able to remove all the deposits of the United States government from the bank. Jackson himself was not empowered to do that, but Jackson's Secretary of Treasury was empowered to do that. So Jackson essentially went to Secretary of Treasury, asked him to withdraw the money. When the Secretary of Treasury refused, he fired him. He kept on firing Secretaries of Treasury until he got to one who actually would agree to do it. So the money was withdrawn from the bank. The bank folded. It was nasty, and it led to a huge recession in the late 1830s that basically doomed the political career of Jackson's, the president came after Jackson. So we don't have a bank in the United States because of Andrew Jackson, so I guess he won. But really, everybody lost because we did get rid of the bank, but it caused a huge recession and doomed the Democratic Party's next president. So not exactly a win there. Okay, number 16, explain the function of a legislative history. So a legislative history is a narrative issued by the legislature that passed a bill. It says what they were thinking about when they passed the bill. Like, what was the point of the bill? What were they saying the bill was for? Now, the reason it's necessary is that a lot of times when courts are looking at bills, they're going to be asking, what was the intent of this bill? What was the legislature trying to do? Well, how do you know what the legislature is trying to do? The answer is you would ask them. And the way you ask them is through the legislative history. Now, that said, legislative history can be used to try and mislead courts. So in recent years, legislatures have gotten smart about trying to manipulate the legislative history. I remember we talked about the Lemon Test and freedom of religion and the Establishment Clause. So in the Establishment Clause, the way it works is we look at the legislative history and determine what the intent of the legislature was. If the goal of the legislature violates the Lemon Test, so they were trying to bring God into the classroom. They had they didn't have a clearly enunciated non-secular reason. That's not religion that didn't have to do with God. Passing the bill's unconstitutional. So if they mention God in legislative history, basically the bill's unconstitutional. So what legislators have done is start to manipulate the legislative history so that they make sure it would pass constitutional muster. So courts, in fact, sometimes now go past the legislative history and say, okay, what were they saying in the press? What were they actually saying in debate? Because we don't necessarily trust the legislative history anymore. So it's just important because that's the official source for what the intent of the writers of the bill was. Okay. It can be manipulated, as we just said, and the presidents historically have been a little jealous of this power, that the legislature gets such an impact on what the interpretation of the bill is. So try and counterbalance it. Presidents have issued signing statements. So the idea here is if the presidency or the governorship is an equal branch to the Congress or to the state legislature in passing a bill, their interpretation should matter too. And that's what a signing statement is for. So a signing statement would say, this is the president's or this is the governor's interpretation of this bill. And they've asked for that to be given equal weight with the legislature when courts are looking at the bill. In practice, in the national government, a signing statement is essentially like a preemptive executive order. It's an instruction to executive agencies in how they should understand the bill and how they should write regulations to comply with the bill. Courts generally don't go along with signing statements as much as they do legislative histories. Although, as we pointed out, courts don't go along with legislative histories nearly as much as they used to anymore anyway. All right, it is 1:30. We have 28 minutes left for you to get your questions in while I am sitting here. So I'm going to go back and do one or two more in the research methods. And then if you've got more questions, again, just put them right over in the chat window. Okay, number 11 says, create a variable representing the interaction of party ID and the belief that Obama is a Muslim. This should be 14 possible values of interaction. What do these values represent about the individual giving that response? Okay, why are there 14 values? Well, there's two values for Obama is a Muslim. Either you think he is a Muslim or you think he isn't a Muslim. 0, 1 if you want to make the math easier on yourself, 2 and 38.2 if you want to make it harder on yourself. So I got 2 values for that, and 7 positive values of part AD. I think it's 0 through 6 or 1 through 7. So if I've set up my variable so it's 0, 1, and 1 through 6 or 1 through 7, what I'm going to find is I've got a value of 0. So if that means I think Obama's a Christian or I don't think he's a Muslim. And 1 would mean Obama is Muslim. I believe Obama's Muslim, and I'm a strong Republican. 2 means I believe Obama's Muslim, and I'm a not so strong Republican. 3 means Obama's Muslim, and I'm a lean Republican. So that'd be all my possible values. So while there might be 14 possible values, remember that it's highly possible that 7 of those values will be the same value. That is, as you said, 0 and 1, a value of 0. All right, so once you've built the interaction effect, remember we're going to build interaction effects by going into the compute variable. If you don't remember how to do the compute variables, you can go back to another YouTube video I got down there. It's going to be on the bottom of the page of my YouTube videos because I made it like 10 years ago that talks about how to run regression SPSS. And so one of the things I show you how to do in there, show you how to do things in there, is to actually build that interaction effect. Essentially, you go in the compute variable. If I want to do party AD x Obama Muslim, I would just call my variable party AD x Obama Muslim. The little equal sign is already there. The party AD variable multiplied by the Obama Muslim variable. Of course, once again, make sure to set all your missing values on those before you go ahead and run the regression. Otherwise, things will be bad. And also before you create the variable. Then in the interaction effect, once you create the interaction effect, the party AD times Obama Muslim, you're going to throw that in as an extra predictor in your model with the other 2 components, party AD and is Obama Muslim. Throw all those together and see if the interaction effect matters. Now, this is just in general, whenever you're doing an interaction effect, make sure that your interaction effect is always, in the model where you have the interaction effect, you also have all the constituent variables. So if I've got party AD times Obama as a Muslim, I need to have the Obama's Muslim variable and the party AD variable in there before I can use the interaction effect. Otherwise, I can't interpret the interaction effect, right? It just doesn't work, right? And when you take that in the next question, you have to take that back in number 10. You have to do expected values again. We do the expected values for anything with an interaction effect. I want you to go back and make sure that, so if we do the expected values in the interaction effect model, you're going to have an interaction effect for party ID, you have effect for party ID, an effect is Obama Muslim, and a third effect for party ID times is Obama Muslim. So if you put in a 1 for party ID, the strong Republican, put in a 1 for party ID, you have to put in a 1 for the party ID part of the interaction effect. So if I've got a value of 1 on party ID and a value of 1 on Obama Muslim, the interaction effect, so it'd be 1 times the beta on party ID, 1 times the beta on Obama Muslim, and 1 times 1 times the beta on the interaction effect. And that'll tell me what the effect of the interaction effect is. Add them all up, don't forget the constant, and you should be pretty good. All right, let me check what was the next one I got here. Oh, okay. So number 44, what ended the era of good feeling? All right, so the era of good feeling, remember election of 1800 was kind of the last gasp of the Federalist Party. Why did Federalists die? Well, a couple reasons. The big one is that John Adams wasn't considered a very good president. Alien Sedition Act was massively unpopular. And so Democratic Republicans came to dominate. After election of 1800, Federalists were on the decline. By about 1812, they were completely gone. There weren't any Federalists left in government. Meaning everything was being run by the Democratic Republicans, which is why we call it the era of good feeling, because you didn't have partisan warfare between Democratic Republicans and Federalists because you didn't have Federalists. So you essentially had a one-party state. This wasn't great because it meant that whoever was picked for a presidential nominee by the Democratic Republicans was essentially a shoo-in to win the presidency. And they picked that person through a relatively undemocratic process called a caucus, or as Andrew Jackson called it, King Caucus. He didn't like it because they picked him. So that's not great, right? If you only have a one-party system, then the primary election, or at that point the caucus, winds up telling you who the president is, and that's probably suboptimal. But what ended this was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson essentially split up the Democratic Republican Party into what we call the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs. So the Whigs previously were Democratic Republicans. They split off, essentially about on the same lines as the Federalists had been, as the original Federalist Party had been. Not quite, but close to it. Regardless, the Whigs split off from the Democratic Republicans. Therefore, you had partisan warfare again, and that's what ends the era of good feeling. Okay, in what ways can Congress control executive agencies? It's number 38. Okay, so if you want to control executive agencies, you've got two basic types of things you can do to control executive agencies. We have ex ante controls and ex post controls. So ex ante controls are controls that are put in place before the agency is able to do something. So an ex ante control would be something like require public comment, require the agency go through a board. So the Department of Labor has to talk to the National Labor Relations Board before they can do anything, the NLRB. And the NLRB is going to be made up, Congress will make sure it's going to be made up largely of representatives of labor unions. So essentially, if the NLRB doesn't like what they're doing, it's hard for the Department of Labor to do anything. So this essentially weights the Department of Labor's action in favor of organized labor because they have to go through the NLRB, and the NLRB is going to be weighted in forms of organized labor. So that's an ex ante controls. It controls what they can do, how they can do it. There's also ex post controls, that is punishing them after the fact. So this could be something like the big gun, of course, here is the power of the purse. That is just the removal of the agency's funding or a statement, a rider in the funding bill that says you cannot spend any money on this. So they're not allowed to spend money on it. Power of the purse, that's the big control. But they can also do smaller things. SHLVs would be considered an ex post control. In addition, for an ex post control, you could have hearings. Nobody likes to be called Capitol Hill under oath to have to answer a bunch of angry congressmen on C-SPAN. I mean, nobody watches C-SPAN, but you get the idea. And so that's embarrassing. Agencies don't like it, so that's bad. They don't like doing it. They don't have to answer questions. They don't like having to deal with congressional oversight, and all that functions as an ex post control. Remember, of course, Congress also, under recent laws, has the ability to overturn laws that are regulations that are passed by the agency. So that's called the Administrative Review Act, and that also would function as an ex post control. Okay, number 56. Would it be fair to say that Marbury v. Madison is a politically motivated decision? Why not? The answer is absolutely. Right? Marbury Madison arises out of the election of 1800 when the Federalists got themselves whooped, so they don't have any power left anymore. So they were engaging in a court packing plan to just create a whole bunch of new courts and fill them up with Federalists. So Marbury v. Madison, the Chief Justice, John Marshall, was one of these Federalists. He got this Supreme Court job as part of this court packing plan. So he was trying to preserve Federalist power. And the way he wanted to preserve Federalist power was by making sure that the courts had more power, right? The only branch of government left where the Federalists had power was the courts. They'd lost both houses of Congress. They lost the presidency. The courts are all they had left. So if they wanted to be an effective group, political party out of power, they needed to make the courts more powerful. And early on in American government, the courts were not actually very powerful. There's a reason the founders regard them as the least dangerous branch of government, right? They didn't really do anything. Since they weren't really doing anything, then the Federalists had to make them more powerful if they wanted to have an impact. So what they do? Well, Marbury Madison, they created this power of judicial review. Now this isn't wholly unprecedented. They make it up of whole cloth. There's some notions of this in the Federalist Papers if you read them. But the enunciation by John Marshall that they had the power to review laws that were passed by Congress and signed by the president and say that they're unconstitutional. Essentially, there's no review of that by the president and Congress was unprecedented at that point. So this was a big power grab. It was a way for John Marshall, a Federalist, to maintain the power of the Federalists in government despite the fact they had lost all the elections. So it was politically motivated? Absolutely. This also comes up when we ask about whether the court today is politically motivated or not. And the answer is, of course it is. The Supreme Court has always been politically motivated. Going back to Marbury Madison, the first major decision of the Supreme Court in the history of the Supreme Court. So it's always been politically motivated. It always will be politically motivated. Okay, so let's go back to research methods. Other things that people need to remember. All right, number 14. We had another question asked me to clarify about number 14. Now, 14 says, generally, we also need to include control variables in our regression models. Common control variables include education, age, income, and dumb variables to race, gender, marital status, and current employment status. Pick at least 2 of education, age, and income, and at least 2 of race, gender, marital status, gun ownership, and employment status to include in your model. If you're constructing dumb variables for these dumb variables to control variables, check to ensure that you have constructed dumb variables correctly. All right, so education, age, and income. I don't actually care which ones you use for that. So education, there's a couple different variables for it. It could be years of education. It's also, there's an interval level variable. ordinal level variable where it's like how much education you get, or high school to graduate, or some college, whatever. Either one of those works fine. Just make sure you get your missing value set up properly. Then you got the list of dummy variables. So race, gender, marital status, gun ownership, and employment status. So for employment status, I would have unemployed as my dummy variable. Gun ownership, have a gun or not have a gun. Marital status. For marital status, the big one is married versus not married, although a lot of people actually use ever been married as the dummy variable. So if you've ever been married, that is, you are married, or you're divorced, or you're widowed, or you're separated. Have those as in opposition to people who have never been married. That would be your dummy variable there. Gender, it's an easy one, though that's not quite the right terminology. You probably should be saying sex rather than gender. It's a whole deal. And then race, as we were talking before, I would like you to have two dummy variables on race. If you have two dummy variables on race, does that count as all of your dummy variables for the two of? No. You have race. If you have race, you have race and gender, and gun ownership, and that's fine. Can you have more than that? Yeah, so at least two of education needs come in, at least two of race, gender, marital status, gun ownership, employment status. So if you want to have three, great, works. Okay, now when you construct dummy variables for these control variables, remember to do that by recode into different variable and create a dummy variable with a 0-1 scale. How do you ensure that you create the dummy variables correctly? I've had people asking about this. It's not hard. Create a dummy variable and then run a crosstab between the dummy variable and the original variable. If you've done it correctly, it should be very evenly divided between 0 and 1 on the dummy variable, and they should correspond with the categories they're supposed to in the original variable. So as long as you do that, you have created your variable correctly. If they don't, you're done messed up somewhere. You hecked up all the way to Goof Town, and you need to go back and fix that. Okay. All right. As I said, we are now 15 minutes left in the session. If you've got questions, you can put them over in the chat box. Or I will keep on checking email if you've got questions sent over email. We'll be doing this again tomorrow for 1 more hour. That'll be the last chance to get questions in. So if you missed this and you're watching this non-live, great. And if you're watching it non-live in the next 23 hours, I'd recommend you get me your questions in advance so I can deal with them in the next one of these tape sessions. All right, question number 34. How have judicial nominees reacted to past borkings? Yeah, borking is one of those words that sounds really dirty. So it actually has to do with pornography, so it's not that far off, actually. So borking borking refers to what happened to Robert Bork. Robert Bork was a judicial nominee put forward by Ronald Reagan. And Bork was responding to the spate of Supreme Court decision in the 1970s that essentially legalized pornography. So prior to the 1970s, pornography was banned in a lot of jurisdictions. So to give you an example, in New York, the Board of Regents, the people who run the schools, actually got to approve of any film before it could be shown, because they did was films are primarily for children. So they have to be educational in some way, or at least not destructive education. So the Board of Regents wouldn't approve pornographic films unless they were for sex ed, I guess, question mark. Anyway, Supreme Court in the 1970s essentially came to the decision, we know this now through, I'm trying to remember what the name of the test is for that. I'll come in a second, the Miller test. So the Miller test that pornography in most circumstances is not obscenity. Pornography does have speech value and therefore is protected under the First Amendment. This was unpopular with a lot of conservatives, including Ronald Reagan. And Robert Bork was a judge, as a federal judge, who had argued that the First Amendment should not be extended to cover pornography, that the First Amendment should be properly limited to political speech and political debate. And essentially, if something wasn't about politics, it wasn't break the First Amendment at all. So as far as Bork is concerned, novels, unless they're debate about current American politics, are not breaking the First Amendment. And so states could ban them if they wanted to. And that's pretty extreme in view of the First Amendment. The founders just said, freedom of speech and of the press. Now, you could argue the reason they were doing that was because they wanted to protect political dialogue. But it wasn't written that way and hadn't been interpreted that way in 100 years at that point. So Bork, while he was certainly qualified to be on the Supreme Court, and he'd been a judge for many years, he was relatively respected, had these sort of extreme views. And he was rejected from the Supreme Court by Democratic senators, not on the basis that he wasn't qualified, but on the basis that his views were out there. They didn't agree with his views. So this is called borking someone. Borking someone means you reject a judicial nominee, could be Supreme Court, could be a district court or the federal court, on the basis of the views, not on the basis of the qualifications. So what do judges do about that? So if you're now to be a judge in post-Borking, you just don't talk about controversies you might have. So if you are skeptical that the right to an abortion exists under the Ninth Amendment, so remember, Ninth Amendment is the one where all these other rights that are just as important. If you don't think there's a right to abortion there, you probably shouldn't say that if you want to move up in the federal judicial system. Because if you say that, then people who believe that the right to abortion does exist in the Ninth Amendment are going to say you're extreme and you can't win and we don't like you. And if you think there is a right to abortion under the Ninth Amendment, you probably also shouldn't say that in your confirmation hearings or write it down where someone can find it, because the people who are against abortion rights will decide you're too extreme and try and bork you. So what nominees, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is an example of this, someone who just didn't talk about her views. We all knew what her views were, but she didn't talk about it. She pretended she didn't have these views when she was brought up as a nominee for the Supreme Court, because she knew if she talked about her views, she wouldn't be able to get it. So what have judges done, nominees for federal courts done in response to the borking? They have hidden their views. So you ask them about about abortion, and they'll say, "What is an abortion? I've never heard of this. That's crazy talk." Right? So they pretend they don't know what's going on. They tend not to have views on important issues because that will get them borked. Side effect of this has been that we're actually getting more younger justices now than we had in the past. We got more younger justices largely because they don't have as long a paper trail. So you might think that we want to have the most qualified judges, the judges who've been there the longest, coming in and making decisions on the Supreme Court. But judges who've been the longest are more likely to have written something that would piss people off and therefore get borked. So they don't get on there. We're getting more and more judges who are in their 40s and early 50s, partially because presidents want to maintain control of the court for a long time. Now, if someone's in their 40s, they might theoretically be on the Supreme Court for 40 years. That'd be great for me as someone trying to build my legacy. But also because they won't have written very many controversial opinions. The more controversial opinions they write, the less likely they are to be able to actually win. All right, 10 minutes left in this session. So next 10 minutes, if you've got questions, you can put them right over in the chat window. If not, that's fine. If you don't have any questions at all, I don't quite know why you're here, if we're being totally honest. If you can't, for some whatever reason, throw stuff over in the chat window, you can feel free to email it over to me, and I will be checking that email pretty regularly. And if I don't get to it in the next 10 minutes, I will get to it in the next session, 23 hours from now tomorrow. Okay, so it says, I found a way to do descriptors using the explore function. Is an acceptable way to find the composite for Muslim and Christian? I don't use the explore function for that. If you want to do descriptors, I would just do analyze descriptors. But if that's giving you mean and standard error, then yeah, go for it, I guess. They've added a lot of functions to SPSS. I guess that's one of the ways to do it. Sounds about right. Analyze descriptors still works just fine, but you do you, whatever makes you happy. All right, number 29, how do Americans vote before the adoption of the Australian ballot? All right, remember what the Australian ballot is. The Australian ballot is one of these progressive reforms of the voting system. So progressive era, about 1890, about 1920, the idea is we're going to perfect government and society by passing the right laws. What sort of laws? Well, one of the things that the progressives want to get rid of is the undue influence of the political parties. So to get rid of this, they introduced the Australian ballot. The Australian ballot is private and printed by the government. So how is that different? The ballot before the Australian ballot, most people voted on ballots that were public. That is, they were color-coded, and they had all the people already written in. So if I were a Republican, I would get my ballot. It would be color-coded. People think it would be red for Republicans and blue for Democrats because that's the color coding we use now. That color coding actually only goes back to the 1990s, so it wouldn't have been those colors. It would have been different colors in every jurisdiction. Regardless, so I'd get my color ballot, I'd put it in the ballot box, and somebody watching to make sure I put the right color ballot in there. So it was non-public, and the ballot was printed by the party. This opened me up to retaliation if I voted for the wrong people. If I was a Democrat and wanted to vote for the Republican, well, I'm out of luck because everyone knows who I voted for, so I might suffer repercussions. And part of the progressive movement is to say that that your vote should be entirely private. And whether you vote or not is a public record, but who you voted for is, in fact, entirely private. This is why in many states it is still illegal to take a selfie inside the voting booth, because then someone could verify who you voted for, take a little selfie with your vote choices, and theoretically pay you. So you can't take selfies inside the voting booth because your vote has to be completely private. So before the passage of the Australian ballot, you voted publicly, that is, people could see who you voted for, and you voted on a party printed ballot. It's important to note also that before that, before the Australian ballot, it was basically impossible to split your ticket. You go for all the Republicans or vote for the Democrats. But how are you supposed to vote for some Democrats, some Republicans? You got to cut out part of one ballot and tape it to the other one. But you can't because tape doesn't exist yet. So what are you going to do, right? There's no such thing as split ticket voting. So that's another important thing we get out of having the Australian ballot. Let's do one more. I'll do two more from American Government Politics. Then we'll go back and see if we've got more questions from the methods. Number 20, explain the importance of McCulloch v. Maryland. That one is straight for your book. Normally, you can't just go back to the book and get stuff. If you look McCulloch v. Maryland up in the index, you can get a pretty good answer to that one. So I'm not going to take our time to go over McCulloch v. Maryland right now. Number 21, explain the major functions of modern national party conventions. All right, National Party conventions, remember they come out of Andrew Jackson and Andrew Jackson's opposition to what he called King Caucus. So what does National Party convention do? Well, it used to be you would actually figure who the nominee was. We talked in class about James Garfield and how he kind of won as a dark horse candidate at the Republican convention. That doesn't happen anymore because we resolve everything through primary elections. So what do they do then? A couple things. Number one, they function as a way for the party to introduce their candidate to the public as a whole. Most Americans don't pay attention to politics until about the summer before the election, the presidential election. So that's when the presidential candidates come out and they go, oh, okay, here's who this person is. Summer, so there's nothing else on TV, so they get pretty good ratings, or used to. Don't get ratings, they're quite as good anymore. So they introduce the candidate to the country as a whole. Second, they let the party sort out the platform. The platform is the statement of beliefs, where the party says, this is what we will do if we get elected. Cool. So they get to put that out, and there's big debates about that. Third, they introduce new candidates of the future. So Bill Clinton had his big national coming out party. No one pays attention to the governor of Arkansas. But at the 1988 Democratic National Convention, Clinton was the one who gave the nominating speech for Michael Dukakis. And the nominating speech was mostly known for being way too long. It was like 90 minutes. It was way too long. But it introduced Bill Clinton. So we knew what Bill Clinton was. The parties used to introduce new candidates. So Cory Booker, had a big role at the last Democratic National Convention, because everyone thinks he's going to be running for president. In fact, he's spending a lot of time in New Hampshire already, so he probably already is running for president. So that's the big things that you get from party conventions. All right, just 5 minutes left to get questions in if you want to answer it on this session. So let's. Okay, so number 16 says based on this model. So I'm referencing the model in number 15. Number 15 is actually the model for number 12, right? It means it's got the interaction effect with all those control variables that you already built. It says construct expected levels of feeling thermometer using stated or reasonable values of your control variable for 3 hypothetical individuals. All right, what I'm asking you to do here is to do an expected value, right? Expected levels of your feeling thermometer. So to give me an expected value calculation, meaning give me a value for every single one of your variables, so reasonable values. So make up 3 people. So this is a 20-year-old African-American female who's a strong Democrat who doesn't think Barack Obama is a Muslim. All right, that's my person. And then I turn all of those characteristics I've assigned to that individual into values of my independent variables. Once I revise my independent variables, then I'm going to go back and run my expected value. So I run the expected value calculation. Again, don't forget about the constant. Make sure that the expected value, the values of the independent variables that are put into the main effects are also put in the interaction effect. Put that all in, and that will give me an expected value for the individual based on the model I built with all my control variables in there. What values should I use for this? The answer is reasonable values. So I just said, 20-year-old white, 20-year-old African-American, give me a value that makes sense. I mean, don't tell me about like an 85-year-old, something who's an independent or a Republican or a Democrat who thinks Barack Obama is a Muslim. Don't give me something crazy. Give me 3 reasonable-looking things. If you're worried about it, you don't know what you're supposed to put down for this, you can't come up with 3 reasonable figures on your own, great. Use yourself, your mom, and your dad, and you're done, right? That's 3 figures right there, and all of you, in theory, exist, so you'll be able to do just fine with that. Okay, so we've got just 3 minutes left. All right, gives you time for one more. So number 17, so number 17 says choose one of the other named political figures from the data set and answer questions 15 and 16 using this new dependent variable. Use your same model that you built for number 15 and then just change your dependent variable and answer questions 15 and 16 using it. So you are going to interpret all the effects of the variables. So you're going to show how they move, what the effect is, just so we understand how to manipulate variables there. And you're going to create 3 new hypothetical individuals. You could actually use the same hypothetical integer number 17 used for number 16. So it could be yourself, your mom, and your dad, and that works just fine. So use all those political variables. And then for number 18, I don't have time to get into too much, but use a different interaction effect. The only thing I would say to take that one out, interact to the other variables that are already in your model. If they're not in your model, they're not going to work. Remember that if you run interaction effect, the constituents of the interaction effect also have to be part of your model. So use 2 other ones, 2 other variables, and that will help you out there. Okay, it is now, well, I'm seeing 1:59, but that is close enough. So a reminder, if you are seeing this in the next day, that is before Wednesday, December 12th, you can come back and email me some questions, and I will deal with those questions in the next session. We'll do this for 1 hour again tomorrow. If you want to be present in the chat for next time, put your questions over there when it starts. Great. We should be able to get to them. If not, then you don't have any questions. Well, good for you. And I will see you all either later this week or next week. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.